Thank you for joining this afternoon for going through the Pearson's EPA Service proposition. My name is Rohini Bhattacharya. I'm the head of apprenticeship services for Pearson, and this part of the apprenticeship delivery is a key part of my role here at Pearson. I'm joined today by my colleague Sapna Khemani, who's at the Pearson office. So we are in different locations too, so do bear with us when we have pauses. If we have pauses through the presentation, we're just handing over to each other. Sapna will help me go through some of the questions that come up from yourselves. So please do use the questions box to ask your questions as we go through the webinar. So today's webinar essentially is about outlining our endpoint assessment service for both training providers and employers. What I thought would be useful for us to go through today was look at the service delivery that we are proposing for the endpoint assessments, look at the process of engaging with Pearson as an EPA organization, and the process is slightly different if you're a training provider vis-a-vis if you're an employer or an employer provider. So we'll just quickly touch upon those differences in the processes. We'll also introduce our EPA service touch points. Some of you might have seen that in the previous webinars that we have run on similar topics, but we'll just touch base on that very quickly. And then we'll walk through two examples of the EPA service delivery for two standards that we are on the register for. The first one being the customer services practitioner, which is quite popular at the moment, and the other one being healthcare support worker, and sort of walk through what that would look like for you as a customer, whether you're a provider or an employer. So moving on to the endpoint assessment service delivery. So just to briefly recap on things that you might know already. So as an EPA organization, as an endpoint assessment organization, what are our responsibilities? So Pearson or any other EPA organization are solely accountable and responsible for the delivery of the endpoint assessment service. Now, this is irrespective of whether we work in partnership with our partners, employers, intermediary organizations from where we might be sourcing the occupationally competent assessors. At the end of the day, the buck stops with us. So our name is on the door when it comes to the delivery of endpoint assessments. We are obviously responsible for delivering the endpoint assessments in line with the requirements that are set out within each of the individual assessment plans specific to a particular standard. As an endpoint assessment organization, we are responsible for designing the assessment instruments. So as you would know, each of the endpoint assessments have probably three or more, in all probability, three or more types of assessments that are included within the endpoint assessment. So as an endpoint assessment organization, we will design those instruments, we will deliver those at the end to the end user, and we will also quality assure the delivery of the endpoint assessments. The responsibility for sourcing, training, and standardizing all of the assessors who are involved in the delivery of the endpoint assessment also belongs to us. That also stays with us as an accountable body. Again, as an EPA organization, we are responsible for all of the internal quality assurance for each of the endpoint assessments that we undertake. And we are also responsible for ensuring the external quality assurance requirements as well. And those actually fall into various different categories, which I'll touch upon briefly. Each of the endpoint assessments are overseen from a quality assurance perspective by an external quality assurance body. And each of those EQA bodies, as we call them, have different requirements for different standards. And again, it's our responsibility to make sure that we adhere to all of those different EQA requirements. We also need to manage proactively any conflicts of interest. This would typically arise in cases where we are using assessors from an employer provider who may have been involved in the delivery of the training, but are also now involved in the delivery of the assessment. So there might be a conflict of interest because the same person might be involved in training and assessments, and we as an endpoint assessment organization need to make sure that we maintain that independence of assessments as an EPA organization. So as I mentioned, there would be sort of EQA bodies, and there can be 4 different categories of external quality assurance bodies, including the Ofqual, the Institute for Apprenticeships, any professional body, or the employer trailblazer groups themselves. So again, as an EPA organization, it's our responsibility to manage any type of audits which come up from either of those EQA bodies, depending on the standard. The Institute for Apprenticeships also carries out their own audits as well from a quality assurance, standardization, and validity and comparability across EPAO's perspective. And then we might see, we haven't seen them yet, but we might be seeing sort of funding compliance audits coming from the Education and Skills Funding Agency as well. And again, from an EPA perspective, we would be responsible for undertaking or adhering to those audits as and when they come along. So what is our EPA services? What do we mean when we say we are delivering endpoint assessment services? So this is an exhaustive list, and I'll just quickly touch upon a few of these, and you might have some questions around this. So this is what we are terming as our endpoint assessment service list. So when you buy an EPA from Pearson, everything that's listed on this slide is included within that particular service that you're buying from us as an employer. So our EPA services would include access to a dedicated account manager as a single point of contact. We would have monthly touch points, which I will touch upon briefly later on in this presentation, which essentially is a monthly touch point with the employer, the provider, potentially the apprentice at some point as well, to prepare towards the endpoint assessment as such. That also includes a countdown to EPA service. So that is very specifically tailored to each individual standard. So we have this service, which is where, again, I'll talk about it a little later on, where we will talk about specific logistics, management, typical issues which would be encountered within a particular specific standard. We have a whole EPA delivery management team in the background that would support the delivery of a high quality service, which is consistent and reliable. So when you sign up for an EPA from Pearson, you would have a named dedicated EPA delivery manager assigned, who would be your first point of contact from a delivery perspective. Obviously, as I mentioned, the responsibility for making sure that you get trained and occupationally competent assessors who are chosen and vetted by us to match our quality standards. That's part of that service as well. For each of the assessments that we undertake, the line manager of the apprentice and the apprentice would get a verbal feedback as well as a written feedback within set timelines. And again, we'll go through those timelines. They do vary from one standard to the other, and they will also vary based on our contractual agreements that we sign with the provider and the employer as well. Again, within the EPA service, that includes our reassessments as well. If for some reason a particular component of the endpoint assessment is not passed successfully by the apprentice. Our services obviously include the certification claim from the endpoint assessment, so we will put together all of that information for the claim of certification from the ESFA. And we also include data and management reporting on an annual basis in order to inform continuous improvement. And I think this is something that we are seeing of considerable value for our employer providers who have got a number of apprentices across different standards. We are currently following a quarterly management reporting framework, which is quite valuable to see from a quarter to quarter how the percentage of pass rates has improved, how the number of apprentices which are going through the endpoint assessment varies from one quarter to the other. So that's essentially, in a nutshell, comprising what we are calling our EPA services. I'll pause there briefly to take any questions, which I can see probably have come in. So Sapna, over to you for any questions that I might have come in so far.
Okay, yes, we have one question. So Will the EPA assessor contact and meet with the assessor to standardize the EPA and plan the EPA?
So I'm assuming you mean the EPA assessor will get in touch with the provider, not the assessor, but the provider.
Yeah, I think that's what it means. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, they will. So again, I'll run through how the process works in practice. So, but absolutely, to answer that question, the assessor will get in touch with the provider to actually schedule the specific dates for when the assessment will actually take place. Yeah. Any other questions?
Not so far.
Okay, great. Okay, so we'll move on. Conscious of the time and the fact that it's quite a long presentation today. So in terms of engaging Pearson as an endpoint assessment organization, what are the steps involved? And there is a slightly different process if you are a training provider, one extra step vis-a-vis if you're an employer provider. So I'll just walk through that very quickly. So as a training provider, most of you would know and are following this already, you sign a letter of intent with Pearson, and that's essentially as soon as you have signed a contract with the employer. Once you've signed the letter of intent, the next stage is to sign an endpoint assessment services contract, and we are just in the process of rolling that out now. So we are getting some feedback from the market in terms of what that looks like, and again, we will be taking that feedback on board to make our process much more efficient from both your perspective as a provider and from the employer's perspective. So, but essentially, the second stage for a training provider is to sign an EPA Services contract, and we need to do that from a compliance perspective, from an ESFA's perspective. Ideally, we would advise that this EPA Services contract is signed at the very latest 6 months before your first date of EPA is due. So not the exact date of the endpoint assessment, but an approximate date. So if you know that the training program for a particular standard is a minimum of 12 months or 18 months, and you know what your approximate endpoint assessment date is, so you can work out what 6 months before then would be. So as a pointer, we would advise that we sign this endpoint assessment services contract at least 6 months before that date. What happens at that point is that you get assigned a dedicated apprenticeship services manager and an EPA delivery manager, and both those dedicated named individuals are actually detailed within the services contract that you sign. So from that point onwards is what gets triggered in terms of our EPA service delivery process, and that's what we'll go through shortly. So that would signing of that contract would trigger off these named people who are then assigned to that particular contract, and then they would start getting in touch to schedule the regular touch points in order to support you in terms of preparation towards the endpoint assessment delivery. And those touch points are typically at 5, 3, 2, and 1 month from the EPA delivery date. So that's in a nutshell is a process for a training provider in terms of engaging Pearson as an endpoint assessment organization. If you are an employer or an employer provider, there's a slightly different process, but what I would say is there is one step less. So an employer or an employer provider does not sign a letter of intent. They directly short circuit to the EPA services contract. And the main reason why that difference is because of the way the funding works. So obviously, as an employer provider or as an employer, they are in control of the levy themselves. So they either draw down that funding that they have paid into the levy, and hence they are the ones who can sign the contract with us directly. With the training provider, we are one step removed from the person who controls the funds, and hence the introduction of a slightly longer process. So exactly the same process in terms of what happens once they sign an EPA services contract. They get assigned again a dedicated apprenticeship services manager and a delivery manager, and again we start off with the regular touch points to prepare them for the endpoint assessment. What I have also indicated here is that we would by default put in a regular contract performance and reporting meetings as part of our contract management and service delivery process. So that's an added benefit for the employer and the employer provider. What I would say is that we will also introduce that for the training providers as well, once we have considerable numbers for a particular training provider. So I've not included that stage because that's a slightly separate category, as in it's part of the EPA service delivery. However, what I would mention is that that's absolutely possible. It would need to cross a certain threshold from a training provider perspective for us to introduce that service for the training providers. So I talked about the EPA Services team, and again, I've touched upon this in my previous webinars, but probably best to go over this again. So in terms of the people that you would be liaising with from Pearson's end on a daily basis, who would that be? So your first port of call and somebody that you probably know already would be the account managers team. These people are responsible for the ownership of the relationship with the provider or with the employer, and this is probably your regular day-to-day liaison person from Pearson in any way. So they will continue to maintain that relationship with you, even from an endpoint assessments perspective, and they would be the first port of call for any of your inquiries for products and services related to apprenticeships. In addition to the account managers, you would, as I mentioned in my previous slides, you would also be assigned an apprenticeship service manager, and the apprentice, the ASM as we call them, easy to roll off the tongue. The ASM's role is essentially around managing that contract and onboarding US customers into the EPA service delivery schedule. So that's specific to the role of the ASM around the EPA service delivery proposition. And then finally, as I mentioned, you get an you get a named endpoint assessment delivery manager. So again, we've got a team of EPA delivery managers at the back end supporting our account managers and our ASMs. And essentially the EPA delivery team is responsible for the management of the end-to-end EPA delivery. So from the point where we start off on the countdown to EPA, that's where the delivery team members take over. And they are the people who are responsible for managing all the assessor allocations, all the logistics of where the endpoint assessment is going to take place, who's going to go there, who's going to greet it, what time it's going to happen, the actual delivery of the assessments on that day, and then any subsequent contact points with respect to results, grading, any appeals or complaints which might come in, and then also ensuring that they are taking care of the quality assurance of those assessments which are delivered. So that, in short, are the different entities or the different people within Pearson who would be your touch points at during different parts of the process of our service delivery. In addition to that, obviously, we have the endpoint assessors who would be delivering the actual assessments. And again, they would be the responsibility of the EPA delivery team members. And then we've got a group of people who we call the internal quality assurers, who are essentially overseeing the endpoint assessors and making sure that they are doing their job properly and they are being consistent in terms of how they are delivering the endpoint assessment. So the last two categories there, the endpoint assessors and the quality assurance team members, are essentially the responsibility of the delivery team. So yes, you will probably see them from time to time. Of course, you will see the assessors when they come in to assess, but your point of contact as a customer would be your EPA delivery manager for everything related to the service delivery of endpoint assessments. So how does the endpoint assessment implementation process happen? So what I've outlined here is, again, looking at those different entities. So what are the responsibilities of the account management team? So as we mentioned, in terms of the process of engaging with an endpoint assessment, specifically for Pearson, so the account management team would be responsible for getting the letter of intent signed off with the training providers. They would also be responsible for making sure that the EPA Services contract has been signed subsequently. And of course, as I mentioned, they would be the single point of contact with you as a customer up to the point of the start of the EPA delivery, at which point the EPA delivery manager takes over. From the account management team and the ASMs actually work very, very closely, and there will be a bit of an overlap because there's lots of information and complex processes and rules and regulations that need to be followed. So I would see that the account management team and the apprenticeship services managers team actually work very, very closely on each of the accounts and the customers that we deal with for these delivery of our EPA services. But as mentioned, the ASM would be specifically responsible for the management of the EPA services contract. They will also be the person who would be conducting the EPA planning meeting, which I'll come to later on. And they will oversee the whole of the EPA touchpoint process. So at some point, the EPA delivery team will come into the picture, the assessors will come into the picture. But if there are any issues, the ASM would be the point of escalation for you to raise any complaints or queries or concerns about the process of the service delivery with regards to endpoint assessments. And of course, in short, the ASMs are responsible for making sure that they're onboarding the providers and employers into the EPA delivery process. So a lot of nitty-gritties around logistics and management, thinking through the greater granular details of the EPA service delivery would all sit within the apprenticeship service manager remit. And finally, we have the EPA delivery manager. So again, a named person that you will see within the contract, and they would be responsible for the management of the end-to-end EPA delivery for the customers. Again, as mentioned, the allocations for the assessors, any kind of logistics relevant for the day for the assessors, feedback around grading, results, appeals, and of course, working with the independent quality assurers as well to support and manage the group of independent assessors who would be undertaking the assessment at your end. So moving on to our EPA service touchpoints, I will just quickly mention this. I mean, some of you might have seen this already in some of the previous webinars. So where are the touchpoints that happen, and what are the processes that we go through? I think we've had some good feedback from both employers and training providers in terms of rolling this out. So again, this is part of the service that we deliver for you as a customer. So at the point of contract signing, we will discuss things like the specific price per EPA per apprentice, the kind of components that would go into each of the standards, what reassessment policy would be applicable and the subsequent price for that, and what kind of payment terms. And this is all encapsulated within the EPA services contract, and your account managers should be getting in touch with you now to actually run through those details. So the process of rolling out the contract would include you having a site of the contract initially that is specific to your particular requirements in terms of the number of standards, number of apprentices that would be undertaking that endpoint assessment. And any details, any queries or concerns that you have, you should get in touch with your account manager to discuss that before you sign the EPA services contract. Once you sign the contract, again, your account manager would be getting in touch with you to set up an EPA planning meeting. Ideally, we say within 8 weeks from the contract signing, and definitely at the latest 6 months before the first approximate EPA date, but that's scheduled. And at the EPA planning meeting, we will go through a number of different things, which I will detail a bit later on. But essentially, that's to set the context, to understand the training delivery that's taking place, to understand the employer's context and the organizational context within which the apprentice is working, because that's really, really important as well from our perspective. So that's essentially what we're terming as the EPA planning meeting. And then subsequent to that, we start with our touchpoint process, what we call the countdown to EPAs, and we've got 3 specific touch points there, starting from 3 months prior to the EPA date, and then again at 2 months, and then 1 month prior to the EPA date. And we look at specific things which are actually tailored to the particular standard that we are delivering the endpoint assessment service for. But I will go through this example to make that come alive a bit later on. And then hopefully after we've sort of handheld the provider and the employer through this process, we will be in a position where the apprentice actually successfully goes on to the gateway stage. So I'll pause there again to take some questions. We will walk through two specific examples of two standards and how this particular process that I've described so far will work in practice. But I'll pause there to take any questions that you might have now. It might become clearer, but over to you, Sapna, to see if you have any questions.
Yeah, there's one more question, but I think Rohini, you might have already answered this, but I'll ask anyway.
Yeah.
So the question is, do you have your EPA services team in place already as you describe it?
Yes. So for our 2018 delivery, we do have the requisite number of EPA Services team in place to manage that. We've obviously been monitoring our numbers since last year, so we know exactly what's coming on board, what's getting cancelled. So yes, of course, we have our capacity in place to manage the service delivery.
Okay, good. We have no more questions at this stage, so I think we can move on.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Sapna. So moving on then to two specific examples of how this process would work in practice. So I'm going to sort of pick up a real world example of an employer provider in the healthcare sector which has a number of apprentices across different standards. And we are finding that the healthcare sector is probably way ahead, understandably so, in terms of putting the apprenticeships levy in place and rolling it out. So the situation, I'll just briefly highlight, is that a letter of intent has been signed with the employer provider for all of the apprentices that have started on program. And our account manager, the Pearson account manager, has just signed an EPA Services contract with the employer provider as well. So the next stage after we've signed the contract, as I mentioned, would be to set up an EPA planning meeting. So what happens at the EPA planning meeting is that our apprenticeship services manager, our ASM, and the account manager schedule a meeting with relevant people within the employer provider to gather some detailed information. And what kind of information we gather is essentially within a information gathering document, and that particular document is sent in advance of the meeting to ensure that relevant people at the employer provider's end can actually input and attend this meeting. So I'll jump off from that slide to actually show you what that document looks like. So here you would see that we've got a planning meeting document. And again, I'm showing a document, but essentially all of the information that is gathered will go onto our system. So it's not a paper-based process, it's going to be an online process. So we've got sort of digital information gathering that's happening. But just to highlight the kind of information that would be gathered from the employer provider and potentially the training provider as well. So obviously section 1 deals with details of the organization that we are getting in touch with, who we are getting in touch with, what their job titles are, the standards for which the apprentices are registered for, so the two standards that we're going to take an example from. I'm not sure what happened there with the telephone number coming on. Section 2 is where we try to understand the context within which the apprentice is working. And this involves a number of things. So one is around the role of the apprentices. So we look at things like how does the apprenticeship strategy actually align with the new apprentices which are taking on. So I've put in some comments there, and again, this is not based on real information. This is just an example which is made up. So in this case, we have got we've tried to look at how the L&D strategy for this particular healthcare provider and the responses that our employer provider has given us is that the L&D strategy is to have 10% of the workforce as apprentices because they think that it's a great way to train the people within the organization and meet the capacity challenges that they have within the organization. They've also mentioned things like Any department which has a current vacancy number which is greater than 20 are required to take in apprentices within their department. And then the apprentices are allocated within specific departments, but they can actually rotate around. So it kind of helps us set the context for the apprentices which are actually that we will be delivering the endpoint assessments to. We also ask specific things around the apprentices. So for this particular example, we've got 10 customer services apprentices, and we've got 4 healthcare social work apprentices. So we will ask questions around where they're deployed. So the employer provider has mentioned that the 10 customer services apprenticeships are actually deployed within the accident and emergency unit, and their main role being the liaison person between the patient and the family and the doctors and the care staff. So obviously setting in the context of the organization and the apprenticeship environment working space, there's lots of fast-paced communications, highly charged environment, high stress environment, irregular working patterns, and obviously probably the need for the apprentice to be a mature worker with high levels of emotional intelligence. Again, all of that context is very important when it comes to the actual delivery of the endpoint assessment service. So it's important for us to get that context earlier on. Again, for the healthcare support worker apprentices, for example, the response, an example response from the employer provider is that the apprentices are working in wards, supporting the nurses and care. I think specifically we were talking about the orthopedic department. So essentially they're taking care of, they're supporting the care, and the nurses are taking care of patients who have been who are being treated for musculoskeletal problems, and just to ensure the kind of patients who are admitted are probably there for a maximum of 1 week to undergo any kind of specific surgery or treatment that they need. So then moving on further, again, it's good to get an overview of the apprentices and whether they are existing members of staff or new recruits. So again, we've captured those details in terms of responses from the employer provider, and any details around how the successful completion of the apprenticeship program influences the professional development of the career pathways for the apprentices is useful for us as well. We have seen in the past that some of the contracts in terms of making sure that the contracts that the apprentice has with the organization is finalized is dependent on them completing their apprenticeship successfully. So those kind of minor details are important, because sometimes that might put under pressure the apprentice or the endpoint assessment organization to actually complete the service delivery within a certain timeline. So, so it might not be relevant for everybody, but it might be relevant for some people, and it's important to capture that earlier on. Then the third section of that document within that planning meeting is around details of training and assessment evidence capture. And again, as an endpoint assessment organization, we don't need to monitor or track that on an ongoing basis, but this is just so that we have a good inkling and as to how that is happening. Because sometimes, again, we have seen that, for example, a standard which has a minimum duration of 12 months is getting completed earlier. So you just want to make sure that the training is being delivered for the set number of time. And again, as an endpoint assessment organization, we are responsible for making sure that we are doing that checklist to ensure that the minimum duration of the apprenticeship training is actually being adhered to. So what we capture in terms of details, I've just highlighted there. We'll just ask a few questions around, how the learning program is structured, what happens on the job, how the line manager inputs to the apprentice, how the off-the-job training element is being adhered to. Each of these standards obviously have different requirements around knowledge, skills, and behavior. So it's just good to know how those different elements are being either taught or learned by the apprentice. It might be on the job, there might be a review that happens every fortnightly, or they might be doing some specific structured content through their intranet. So just good to know what kind of, how that delivery is happening from an apprentice's perspective. And then any kind of documentation to capture regular progress reviews between the apprentice, the line manager, or the trainer. It's good to know in advance. Sometimes the standards and the assessment plans actually ask the endpoint assessment organization to evidence the progress reviews that have taken place as well with the apprentices. So again, this would depend on a case-by-case basis. And then just looking at some specifics around monitoring skills, behaviors. So these are important from a gateway signing off process. So when it comes to the employer signing off the apprentice to ensure that they are happy that the apprentice is ready to take their assessment, it's good to know how they've actually arrived at that conclusion, whether that is being captured throughout the apprentice's journey in terms of reviews, evidence, documents, etc. And then finally, the section 4 is around the detailed information that Pearson provides to the employer provider or the training provider. And again, I've put down the specifics for the 2 standards that we are looking at here. So we will deliver some details around the customer services practitioner, for example, what are the different components and what kind of delivery timelines we're looking at. So the customer services practitioner has 3 components: the showcase, the observation, and the discussion. And I've indicated that the showcase is up to 10 hours of the apprentice's time. So that's, again, it's a discussion to have with the apprentice, the training provider, and the employer based on their working pattern. So in this case, as you mentioned, as you saw earlier on in this document, that the apprentices who are undertaking the customer services practitioner are actually working in the accident and emergency department. So obviously, their time is precious, and the employer provider might not want them to take out 5 hours of 2 separate working days for them to complete or compile their apprentice showcase. So it might be that we agree that, okay, if we are to give this apprentice showcase preparation time, then we will carry out the apprentice showcase on one single day, which is broken down as X number of hours given to the apprentice to compile the different elements of their showcase, and then for us to evaluate that at the end of that particular day. Again, details of what needs to go into that showcase will come subsequently in the subsequent touch points that we have. So again, we will set expectations, we will provide templates, we will provide briefs as to what that looks like in more detail. But at this EPA planning stage, all we're doing is to set out expectations around the service delivery with the employer and the training provider. Again, we'll discuss the evidence requirements at the gateway stage that are required. It's pretty much standardized for both of these standards that we're talking about here. So English and Maths, level 1 to be achieved, level 2 test to be attempted, making sure that we have evidence of a minimum of 12 months on program. We do have a gateway sign-off form that the employer actually signs off, so making sure that we get sight of that as well. And then the apprentice declaration form, essentially the apprentice needs to sign a form that, again, we will provide a template for to agree that they allow Pearson to claim their apprenticeship certificate from ESFA. So we need the apprentice's consent to do that. And then we will discuss the approximate EPA dates. So again, we would know when they have started, so approximate EPA dates for when that would be carried out. We will outline what the assessor allocation process looks like, and I'll touch upon that briefly in a little while. And then we will also look at the reassessment policy, any questions you might have, timeframes, etc., etc. And a similar thing, similar kind of details for the healthcare support worker as well. So it's essentially, in short, those are the kind of information gathering that would happen at the EPA planning stage. And again, I would stress that this is our first draft of actually rolling this out. It might be that we collect more information, less information subsequently as we keep on continuously improving our service delivery. So jumping back on to our presentation again, so we've talked about the EPA planning meeting and what happens in terms of the detailed implementation. After the EPA planning meeting, the next stage is at 3 months prior to the endpoint assessment date. Now, obviously, if we have said that at the latest we should have the contract signed 6 months before the approximate EPA date, then we are assuming that will probably take another 2 to 3 weeks to get the EPA planning meeting in place. So that's at the 5th month. So there is a gap between that 5th month and the 3rd month before the EPA date. So I'm not saying that we will not be touching base with you during that time. Of course, by any means, do get in touch with any questions you might have for the account managers. What will also happen during the time is that you will get an EPA specification document, which is essentially our Bible or our end-to-end guide for everything that you need to know about endpoint assessments, how they're going to be assessed, what are the outcomes and the criteria that need to be assessed within each of those different components specific to a standard. So the time between the first EPA planning meeting, at which point we will give the specification document to you, if not earlier, you have the opportunity to actually digest that document and probably ask us specific questions at that countdown to EPA stage, which is 3 months prior to the endpoint assessment. So what happens at that countdown touch point is that a Pearson ASM and an EPA delivery team member will carry out the first meeting. And following on from the planning meeting, where obviously the ASM and the delivery team manager has all those details that we had captured in the first instance, we will check on how the apprentices progressing through their program. We will also look at the progress on the evidence gathering for the specific elements for the endpoint assessment. So we will look at things like the showcase elements. So again, as mentioned before, we had specific evidence collation, which can vary from an apprentice to apprentice. It can vary on the type of role that they're doing. It can vary on the type of organization that they're working for. So we will set those, we will discuss what those might look like at the EPA planning meeting, and then follow up on how that evidence gathering is actually taking shape later on at the countdown to EPA meeting. For the healthcare support worker, for example, there's a need for a portfolio or a reflective journal, and the format for that, again, would be detailed within the EPA specification document. So you will have that at the time that you sign the contract with us. Once you've got the template, you might go away and look at the details of that, have some questions, or maybe see that there's a different way of doing it and want to check that. So again, we'll check on whether every party or every partner is comfortable with what's been outlined in the guidance around that. We will also then talk about some access requirements. So in this specific example, obviously the customer service apprentices are working in the accident and emergency department. So we need to agree very early on what the best time would be for a practical observation and the professional discussion. Now, the assessment plan for the customer services practitioner says that the observation and the discussion should happen subsequently. So essentially, the assessor would observe the apprentice within their workplace environment and then have a professional discussion after the observation. So ideally on the same day. Not ideally, it has to happen on the same day. So if that's the case, then we are looking at probably 2.5 hours out of the apprentice on their day at their very, very busy place of work within an A&E unit. So again, things like, do we have a room for the professional discussion? We want to take the apprentices away from their normal day-to-day bustle and hustle of the A&E department. What kind of access requirements are required for the endpoint assessor, for example, to get into the A&E unit for a hospital trust? Again, that might influence the type of assessors or the category of assessor that we can actually deploy for this particular assessment. And then any kind of, for the healthcare support worker, for example, who is also going to see a workplace observation for the apprentices working within that unit, what kind of patient consent form? So obviously the healthcare support worker would be working with patients, as will the customer services apprentices as well. So any kind of patient consent form. So just those kind of access requirements and the details around that we would talk about at this particular meeting as well. And then English and maths requirements, typically, if they have an exemption and they've got already a level 1 achievement, that's fine. We would still need to see the evidence of that in terms of a certificate previously completed, or if they need to attempt a level 2 prior to the gateway, just setting the timelines around that as well. So that's the first of the countdown touchpoint meetings. 2 months prior to the endpoint assessments, well, actually, maybe I should just pause there very quickly, just conscious of the fact that I'm downloading a lot of information. I can see maybe there's a question there, Sapna, for us to answer before I move on.
Yes, there are a few questions come through, so I'll read them out.
Yeah.
First question, do we pay for EPA for a specific learner at a specific touch point? And what happens if the learner leaves? Can we transfer that fee to another learner?
Okay, good question. So what we are proposing is that the payment for the endpoint assessment gets triggered at this stage that I'm highlighting now. So 2 months prior to the endpoint assessment is when your first payment for the endpoint assessment gets triggered off. And what you pay for at this stage is just 10% of the endpoint assessment. Ideally, by this stage, you would know whether your apprentice is still on program or has left already or does not intend to complete. But essentially, you don't pay anything till 2 months prior to this endpoint assessment.
Okay, another question. Are assessors able to have the information before the planning meeting so that everyone is clear on what specifically is required?
Yeah, sure. So absolutely. When you sign the contract, the EPA Services contract is when you should be receiving the specification document. Now, I know that at this stage, we are in a place where we are still developing our assessment instrument and specification document before we've signed the contract. But the way we are trying to schedule our contract signing is that we are very, very close to finalizing our specification document. So in this particular first year, there might be a lag between you getting that specification detailed document at the contract stage. But ideally, absolutely, once we are up and running with most of our endpoint assessments, you should be able to receive your specification document as soon as you've signed the contract.
Okay, we have one more question. It's about the standards that we're currently offering. And the question was about whether we would have, when would we have the EPA across all these standards available?
So that probably I can't give you a timeline for each of the endpoint assessments or standards that we are registered for. But what I can do is to share that information with our account managers who would be able to download that information to you. I would say that if you give us a couple of weeks, we should get that information out to the account managers specifically on a standard by standard basis. What I will highlight is that there are considerable issues with the assessment plans, which are delaying the development. And again, that is not specific to us as an EPA organization, but that probably plans across a few EPA organizations. Some have got their head around that, some haven't. But essentially, what we are trying to do is to escalate those assessment plan ambiguities to the EQA bodies as well as the IFA for us to get some kind of an amnesty in terms of delays. But we will be communicating those to yourselves as customers very, very soon. However, your account managers in the next couple of weeks should have a timeline around when we should be finalizing the EPA specifications for the standards that we are on the register for.
Okay, and one more question that just come through. Are there any free, sorry, I'll read one before that. At what point do maths and English have to be achieved? During EPA planning meeting or specific touch points?
No, so no, maths and maths and English achievement do not have to be completed anytime before the gateway stage. So what I've just highlighted is the fact that you as a provider or an employer need to be aware what the requirements are for maths and English, However, the achievement of those maths and English requirements as per the details within the standard need not be completed till the apprentice reaches the gateway stage. So ideally, the employer should not sign off the apprentice at gateway unless they have achieved their maths and English.
Okay, let's move on from there. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, then this stage, which is the second of the countdown to EPA meetings, is ideally 2 months prior to the EPA date. And sure, okay. And what happens at this stage is that, again, the Pearson ASM and the EPA delivery team member schedule a meeting, or they can also schedule a call to walk through some of the specifics. So this is around now registering the apprentices on the EPA system, as I mentioned. So some of the details. So we will walk you through what that system looks like. And you just need to register the details of the apprentices. You probably need to specify the EPA delivery location. So on this occasion, we would have the customer services, probably the same location for all 3 components, because essentially 2 of the 3 components need to be done at the workplace. And then 1 component, which is a showcase, can happen somewhere differently, but we will look at what that looks like. For the healthcare support worker specifically, in this case, there is a multiple choice test that's involved, followed by the observation and the interview. So it might be that the multiple choice test actually takes place in a different site to the hospital, and then the observation and interview takes place at the normal workplace. So those kind of nuances in terms of the different locations probably need to be captured at some point on the system as well. So we'll walk through all those details at that stage. In terms of the delivery timelines for the endpoint assessment, again, we mentioned about the apprentice showcase taking approximately 10 hours of the apprentice's time. So just setting expectations on what that looks like. It might be that for these customer services apprentices who are working in the A&E department of a busy hospital, some apprentices prefer to do it on 2 separate days. They prefer to sort of compile their showcase on one day and then actually present their showcase on a different day. But all those, and it might be that of those group of 10 apprentices, 7 prefer to do it on 2 different days, 3 prefer to do it on one day. As long as the apprentice, the provider, and the employer are happy with that arrangement, we don't have an issue in following those different arrangements for each apprentices. So it's all those kind of details that need to be detailed out in terms of agreeing with the provider, the apprentice, and the employer. The healthcare support worker, for example, the multiple choice test, it needs to be taken first before it's followed up by the observation and the interview. So it might be, if it's in a different location, for example, then it might be that, again, the apprentice needs to go into a different location. It's time out from their daily work. So again, setting those expectations with the employer and the provider and the apprentice that this will take them away from the normal sort of day-to-day work as well. So again, agreeing those details. And then we will also set expectations around the gateway sign-off dates, the declaration forms that the employer and the apprentice needs to sign, and then outline that the assessor allocation will happen once the apprentice has been registered on our system and what that might look like. So you've registered your apprentices on our systems. That triggers the assessor allocation from our system as well. What is going to happen is that the assessors would agree to a certain date, and subsequently we will look at the next stage, which is essentially a month before the approximate EPA date. So what happens at this stage is that the EPA delivery team member, so essentially the point of contact has now moved from the ASM through to the delivery team member. And the delivery team member then agrees the logistics for submission of the portfolio for the healthcare support worker, or the showcase elements for the customer services one. They just make sure that you've got sight of all the maths and English qualification evidence from the apprentices. And they will also communicate the allocated assessor details, who would then get in touch to actually schedule the exact date of the endpoint assessment with the employer and the apprentices themselves. At this stage, at least a month before the endpoint assessment is due, we should have a gateway sign-off date and checklist agreed. So we will have a template sent to you, which is essentially a pro forma for the employer to sign off as a gateway for the apprentice to make sure that they're happy and confident that the apprentice is ready to take their assessment. And there'll be a checklist of evidence documents at that point that we would need from the training provider, the employer, or the apprentices, which kind of signifies the apprentice having gone through or gone past the gateway stage. And then subsequently at that stage, the assessor who has been allocated to your apprentice would be in contact to schedule the exact EPA dates and confirm the location and any access arrangements that they need to be aware of. So for example, they might need to bring their ID, there might be parking restrictions, etc., etc. So we just need to sort of make sure that the assessor is aware of that themselves. So hopefully at that stage, we go into the gateway stage, at which point what happens is that the employer signs off the gateway declaration form in consultation with the provider at some point and in some places. All the evidence requirements and files are transferred or sent to Pearson, which again, as I mentioned, the evidence of the maths and English requirements and portfolio submissions or presentations which need to be passed on to the independent assessor. Pearson, once they have received all those evidence at the gateway stage, will confirm receipt within 24 hours of having received that document for the apprentice. And if there is anything missing in terms of the evidence that we need from the employer or the apprentice, then we will communicate that within 24 hours of submitting of those evidence documents. So hopefully it all goes smoothly. We have all the evidence at the gateway stage, and we have now come to the actual date of delivering the assessments, the EPA delivery date. So what happens is on that particular day, or maybe a number of days, might not all happen on the same day. It might be prolonged over a number of days, especially in this case where the healthcare support worker apprentice, for example, needs to take a test on a particular day, followed by the observation and the interview. So the endpoint assessment, the face-to-face elements are carried out by the independent assessor as per the pre-agreed schedule. Any new assessors, for example, so any assessor who is essentially doing their first EPA would need to be accompanied. And this is part of our quality assurance approach. So again, we will inform the employer and the training provider of this particular requirement at the time of allocation, because when we are allocating the assessors, we would know whether this would be their first time. So again, there will be access arrangements that need to be made for an additional person. So we will highlight that. We will communicate the provisional results and any feedback verbally to the apprentice and the employer at the end of that particular EPA. So if you're carrying out the workplace observation and the interview, so there are two elements of the endpoint assessment. The feedback for that in terms of how the apprentice has performed, what criteria they have met successfully, any shortfall that they could have addressed better would be detailed at the end of the day to the apprentice and the employer. The apprentices, the assessors' records in terms of whatever notes they take from the assessments are quality assured after that, and then a summary of those results that detail the performance of the apprentice, any criteria that they have passed successfully or failed, if God forbid, would be shared electronically within 5 days from the date of the endpoint assessment. And then if, for example, if there at all there is a requirement for a reassessment, those arrangements will be made by our EPA delivery team member. So following that, what happens with the notification of results and the certification? So Pearson provide what we call a notification of results for completing the EPA successfully. It's not a certificate because it's only the ESFA that can provide the apprenticeship certificates. So we will also collate all the evidence for that claim of the apprenticeship certificate from the ESFA. If there is any missing evidence or paperwork that we need, the EPA delivery team member from our end will contact the employer or the training provider to ask for that missing evidence. We then upload everything onto the ESFA portal, and ESFA then validate those claims and sort of process the certification on a monthly basis. The training provider's sort of role is to make sure that they have actually updated the apprentices' ILR records on the system, and then the certificate is currently actually sent directly to the employer by the ESFA. We have no control of when and how that happens. So we just sort of process the claim, and then it is up to the ESFA to actually send that information through. So hopefully all of those different elements will then culminate in the delivery of a high quality EPA service from Pearson on a consistent basis. And that, in short, well, not really short, but that sort of encapsulates our EPA service delivery proposition. So I'll pause there. You will get obviously the copy of the slides, but I'll pass the handle back to Sapna to see if there are any additional questions for us to finish up on.
Yes, just one more question. For the multiple choice tests, will these be delivered via the Pearson online test platform?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So the idea is that majority of our standards at the moment, we would use the Pearson online platform, and we will integrate those results with the other endpoint assessment instruments to come at a final aggregate grade for the apprentice for the endpoint assessment. Some of the standards we are proposing to use a slightly different system, again from Pearson, but primarily for ease of access from an employer and apprentices perspective. But obviously all those details we will share with you subsequently on a standard by standard basis.
Okay, there are no other questions at this point.
Okay, that's great. So thank you very much for your time. Apologies for running over slightly, but I hope that has been useful. And if you do need any more details, then please do get in touch with your account managers or do email us directly on our contact details on the website. But hopefully that's been useful. And thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and speak to you all very soon.